Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. Now in this video I want to talk about courage. The Courage to Be by Paul Tillich, my maybe mid-rush nonfiction, and a legitimately excellent, if abstruse book. It's a series of 6 lectures printed in book form that Tillich gave in 1952. And it is his attempt as a philosopher, as a theologian, as a human being, to explore this idea around how do we continue being, how do we live as creative beings, as human beings, how do we love in a world that has just seen World War II, the Holocaust and the state murder of millions of human beings, the US dropping atomic bombs on Japan. How do we continue to live and continue to be in this world? And it also is, I think, a very real attempt by Tillich to respond to the movement of dread, of existentialist dread, out of, sort of intellectual circles, artistic circles, parlors, and into homes, into people's minds, where more and more, people who are from all walks of life are beginning to question the sense of meaning in life, this sense of meaninglessness that they feel. And this is Tillich's attempt to really respond to that in a very thoughtful and thorough way. And I cannot recommend reading this book highly enough, even if the beginning is a bit heavy. But to set Tillich up with his idea around what courage is, I do want to begin with our friend the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz. True courage is in facing danger when you are afraid. And that's an idea I think many of us are familiar with, that idea of courage is fear holding on a moment longer, being able to press forward even when you're afraid. And that's kind of a common mantra that we have experienced. But Tillich is interested from a different perspective. And he's really interested in some key words that we're going to find in this final sentence. This is what he closes his book with. The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. And there's 2 pairs there that are really critical for reading The Courage to Be. One is the link between courage and being, and the other is this link between anxiety and doubt. Tillich owns this idea that we have so many doubts now. We have so many doubts about our relationships to others, our place and purpose in the universe, that creates anxieties. And these anxieties can be debilitating. They can be crippling in terms of our ability to be creative beings, to be active beings. And so courage is a response to those anxieties and at their root, those doubts. And so that's what his whole book is exploring. And the courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. And it's a powerful and authoritative end to a wonderful book. So he begins with a historical perspective on courage. He takes us all the way back to Plato and Socrates and the dialogue Laches, where he comments, as many readers of Plato have done, that Plato and Socrates are much better at tearing down the misconceptions that exist around, traditionally bolstered definitions, rather than necessarily providing a final definition, successful definition of their own. And he goes, I don't know that I'm going to succeed, but here we go. And he then moves through this historical perspective. He brings in the Stoics, he brings in Spinoza, and he really just explores all these different ideas of being. And that's the first 40 pages of the book. And that's probably the heaviest, hardest reading for anyone from any background. I had read many of the works he references in there, and it was still probably the driest sections. But you get this sense, remember these were given as lectures originally, you get this sense that he's warming up his ideas. And we really reach that crescendo around like page 60, where he starts to examine this idea around anxiety. And he has a page in here that's absolutely phenomenal. And I think it still is so relevant today. Anxiety is the awareness of unsolved conflicts between structural elements of the personality, as, for instance, conflicts between unconscious drives and repressive norms, between different drives trying to dominate the center of personality, between imaginary worlds and the experience of the real world, between trends towards greatness and perfection and the experience of one's smallness and imperfection, between the desire to be accepted by other people or society or the universe and the experience of being rejected, between the will to be and the seemingly intolerable burden of being which evokes the open or hidden desire not to be, All these conflicts, whether unconscious, subconscious, or conscious, whether unadmitted or admitted, make themselves felt in sudden or lasting stages of anxiety. And how have we all not experienced that on a monthly, if not weekly, if not daily basis, where we strive for something and we fail. We hope that we are accepted, even as children, and we realize that we are not by everyone. And for many of us later on as adolescents, as adults, we continue to strive for a sense of acceptance while finding rejection in some form. And for some people, they maybe don't experience as much rejection, but many do. And Tillich is just exploring this and hammering this idea so eloquently. And so if those are our experiences which introduce all of these anxieties, here's Tillich's response: courage does not remove anxiety. Since anxiety is existential, it cannot be removed. But courage takes the anxiety of non-being into itself. Anxiety turns us towards courage because the other alternative is despair. And I think that for Tillich's audience, for an audience now in the aftermath of the past year globally, and even with conflicts that are bursting out right now this week, that is a very real feeling. It becomes a question that there is a path to really just embrace this sense of meaninglessness and ultimately despair, or to look at the alternative, which is this path of courage, is what Tillich is arguing. And he presents an idea then that we sometimes almost try to cut a deal with our anxiety, that and with this sense of meaninglessness and despair, that we will accept a sense of being, of partial being, of unfulfilled being, that is not our full potential, and that we know that, but we're willing to settle for that because it relieves us of some of our anxiety. And it's a really interesting and I think accurate portrayal of many of the decisions and the compromises that we're willing to make when we think about the pressures we feel, the pressures for our families, the pressures for our loved ones, the pressures for our own existence and our own happiness. And so Tillich is really just, he's a very modern thinker, and it works so well. But he begins then to move, he does a very long survey of existentialism. He brings in ideas from Nietzsche, and he explores the different aspects of sort of 19th century existentialism, and then defines the end of the 19th century as the beginning of World War I. July 31st, 1914 is when he says that's the end of the 19th century, and then the guns of August blaze and World War I begins, and we have this mechanized warfare where it's, the mass destruction of human beings and of human creativity. But he does introduce this idea. He goes, as he's pushed through that, he then goes, okay, so what is the answer to that sense of meaninglessness? The answer to these this existentialist thinking that is becoming more and more common, more and more pervasive. And he goes, there is a belief in forgiveness in all forms of man's courage to be. And he then, this is not a book where you need to have read the Bible or read the New Testament to be familiar with Tillich's thinking. There are a handful of times where he does bring in quotations, but he's not a religious thinker, a religious philosopher who is primarily quoting from the Bible. But he does bring in here that idea of, from the letters of Paul, he who is unacceptable is accepted. The victory over the anxiety of guilt and condemnation is sharply expressed. One could say that the courage to be is the courage to accept oneself as accepted in spite of being unacceptable. So if we go back to that idea of our real world experiences diminish our hopes, diminish our aspirations because of our rejection, because of the rejections we face, and that introduces doubts, that introduces anxieties, then the courage to be is recognizing that despite those rejections, despite being viewed as unacceptable and perhaps being unacceptable, there is a way in which someone, including ourselves, can accept us and we can belong. And that once we have made that, have sort of accepted this idea that we actually can belong, that we are not rejected because we are totally worthless, but that we do have worth, we do have value, that sense of our own acceptance can suddenly give us courage, can give us action. And as a reference, being itself is essentially productive. The way in which the originally religious word creative is applied without hesitation by Christian and non-Christian alike to man's productive activities indicates that the creative process of history is felt as divine. So if we can move beyond meaninglessness and move beyond a feeling of paralysis through that courage to be, then we get to become creative beings again. And he's really reaching his crescendo now. Conquest of the anxiety of guilt is also conquest of the anxiety of fate. The courage of confidence takes the anxiety of fate as well as the anxiety of guilt into itself. It says, in spite of, to both of them. This is the genuine meaning of the doctrine of providence. Providence is not a theory about some activities of God. It is the religious symbol of the courage of confidence with respect to fate and death. For the courage of confidence says, in spite of, even to death. And so that's the sense of dread is that sense that we are the only beings on earth that recognize our own mortality and are aware of that. And depending on our experiences, can be aware of that from a very young age. So if we know the ending, how do we pursue our way through the rest of that book? How do we pursue our way through the rest of our lives? And Tillich responds resoundingly, like, as we have identified all of these aspects of the world that are rejection, the ideas we had around, and he owns this, that ideas we had around God maybe don't feel valid in light of our experiences. As we move through that, we then accept ourselves. We realize we are accepted in his belief system and in mine because God has accepted us, even though we're unacceptable. And that gives us that courage to be. And it gives us a courage to be, to move forward. And so, again, it really is a wonderful book. I do recommend it. And it's not a particularly long book. It's 6 lectures, so I read it as one each day last week, and then I got sick last weekend, so I didn't post a video on it. But it really, it's not a particularly hard read if I think, you take it in some doses. But I do recommend it. He's a wonderful, wonderful writer, wonderful thinker, and it feels like a wonderful person. In terms of some other works that, if you've read this, you might have read these as well. I haven't read all of these, but they certainly connect. Another sort of predecessor, or colleague, I should say, of Tillich's in certain ways would be Reinhold Niebuhr, who about 20 years earlier, before World War II, wrote the famous Moral Man and Immoral Society. Yeah. And then The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness as a defense of democracy sort of during World War II. Tillich as well wrote an enormous masterpiece called Systematic Theology, which is much longer. This is much more like theological and exploring primarily Christian ideas and in much more detail. And as I mentioned, Tillich is referencing the Laches of Plato, which I might do a video about this summer. It's not my favorite dialogue, and it's an early dialogue, so it's probably more Socratic than Platonic. He references existentialists to a large degree, and the basic writings of existentialism is an anthology the Modern Library has that is pretty good. I particularly enjoy the Miguel de Unamuno y Hugo sections. Those are, and the Simone de Beauvoir sections are strong in here. And of course he references Nietzsche, including Zarathustra, and I think one of those quotes had the will to power in it. Tillich himself was an enormous influence on Martin Luther King Jr., as was Niebuhr, but Tillich was an enormous influence on King. And I don't know that he was an influence on Raymond Brown, but there was certainly the sort of affiliation with the Union Theological Seminary. And so Raymond Brown's introduction to the New Testament, I think, feels like it's written by someone who has read Tillich's lectures. And of course, I'm reading Marilyn Robinson's Gilead and finding, this is sort of set in a contemporary time to The Courage to Be. And there are certainly some interesting parallels, and I was hoping there would be. And so I'm finding some interesting parallels, and I'll probably have a video about this next week. But again, if you've never read Tillich, I recommend it. I would start with The Courage to Be, not with Systematic Theology. That was the recommendation to me by my uncle. But if you have read Tillich, please let me know, what your thoughts are. And again, I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.